So my name is Jennifer Janusz. I am a pediatric neuropsychologist here with the Extraordinary Kids Clinic program in Denver. So I've maybe had the pleasure of working with some of you guys or some of your kids. And I'm going to be talking about executive functioning skills today. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the cognitive features that we see in kids with XY variations, and then move pretty quickly into executive functioning skills themselves with an eye to what we want to think about in terms of interventions and assessment of those kinds of things. So we know that kids with XY variations are at risk for lowering of IQ. Average IQs typically are on our test range from 90 to 110. For most of the populations, including Klinefelters, XYY, and trisomy X, we see what we call a downward shift of that normal variation. So instead of kind of their IQ average falling in the average range, they fall more into that low average range. And then boys with XXYY's IQ is a little bit lower than that. Kids with all of these disorders we know are at risk for academic problems and learning disabilities, for ADHD, for autism spectrum disorders, and for a variety of social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties, as well as adaptive functioning deficits. They're also at risk for executive functioning deficits. In my talk, what I want to talk about today a lot is how these executive functioning deficits are really going to impact functioning in all those other areas. Executive functioning skills are really key to a lot of what we do academically, in real life, socially, and so we want to think about that across the spectrum of behavior. Okay, so what are executive functioning skills? Executive functioning skills are the skills that are involved in kind of purposeful, goal-directed behavior. So the kind of skills that allow us to look at what is this task I'm trying to complete and what are the steps that I need to accomplish that sort of goal. It's our ability to look at a complex situation and figure out what's going on in that complex situation, to pay attention maybe to multiple things at once, or the opposite, to resist distraction, only pay attention to one thing at a time and ignore what might be going on around me. It's our ability to inhibit an inappropriate response, so to not be impulsive, and sustain behavior for relatively long periods of time. One way, kind of the classic metaphor we think of executive functioning skills is that they're really the command center or the conductor of our brain. So that really helps us to sort of rally all of our other cognitive skills to use. So there's lots of models of executive functioning skills. The one that I think is the easiest to understand puts executive functioning skills into three big buckets. So behavioral regulation, emotional regulation, and cognitive regulation. Each of those have skills that go into these. I'm going to talk about them so we kind of have a frame of reference as we talk more about what we do about these kinds of skills. So behavioral regulation is broken down into your ability to inhibit and self-monitor your behavior. Emotional regulation includes things like being able to shift flexibly between things, as well as regulate your emotions. And cognitive regulation includes your ability to initiate tasks, your working memory, your ability to plan and organize, your ability to monitor your own task performance, and your ability to organize your materials. So let's talk about behavior regulation. So behavior regulation, as I mentioned, includes your ability to inhibit. So your ability to inhibit is to stop an action or not react to an impulse. So if a kid says something really nasty to me, my inhibitory skills are going to come into play when I don't hit them or grab their toy away from them, right? It also comes into play when I don't say something rude to somebody else. Even though I might be thinking it, it's not going to come out because my inhibitory skills are going to kick in. My ability to self-monitor my behavior means that I'm aware of my effect of my behavior on others, and I'm going to change my behavior accordingly. So if I'm in a social situation and I'm doing something kind of annoying, and I see that other kids are maybe getting annoyed with my behavior, I can pick up on those cues to change my behavior to meet that situation. Emotional regulation includes our ability to shift. So that includes things like being able to shift from one task to another, to transition between things, to use flexible problem solving. So if maybe I'm using a strategy, but that strategy is not working, I can try something new to try to complete the task that I'm doing. And as well as emotional control, our ability to regulate our emotions. And this includes things like not getting too silly in a situation. Sometimes, kids get kind of over the top silly and they can't bring it back down. Not getting too sad or too dramatic in a situation, all those kinds of things. Cognitive regulation, or what we used to kind of think of as what we called metacognitive skills, those kind of skills, those higher order thinking skills that really help us to kind of pull everything together and get stuff done. So initiation can have a task component, so can I sit down and get a task started independently? But also an idea generation component. If I have to write an essay or if I have to think of different ways to solve a problem, can I initiate and think about new ideas to do this? Working memory is our ability to hold information actively in mind. An example of this is if I was going to give you a phone number, you were going to go down the hallway, you'd kind of keep that phone number in your working memory while you were walking down the hallway, but once you dialed that number, you would get rid of it. So it's not information that we're putting into our long-term memory, it's information that we're using online in the moment. Another good example of this is multi-step directions. Brush your teeth, get your bag, grab your shoes, and meet me in the car. 4 steps, okay? So how well can you hold those 4 steps in your working memory? I have an 8-year-old, not well. Okay, planning and organization. I have something I have to do. How well can I plan my steps to get there? How well can I organize myself to get there? Can I keep my stuff organized? Organization of materials. What does my backpack look like? What does my room look like? What does my desk at school look like? And then task monitor is ability to attend to our own performance on tasks. So things like if I am doing work, can I check my work for careless errors? So how well can I monitor what I am doing in a situation? So what do executive functioning problems look like? The classic is the walking tornado. So the kid walks in the door, there's one shoe here, there's one shoe there, there's a backpack, there's an empty Cheetos bag, and then they can't find their homework, right? Forgetting to turn homework in, even if it's completed, even if it's put in the homework turn in folder, what happens to that homework? Difficulty completing long-term school projects or following complex directions, losing track of time or not using time efficiently. And many times, this is an important key here, lots of times kids with executive functioning problems, especially kids who are a little bit higher functioning anyway, these problems are viewed as kids being lazy or not trying. Because many times it's something that seems fairly simple, like cleaning your room. Well, you're a relatively smart kid. Why can't you keep your room cleaned? And it's really now I'm not saying kids can't be lazy, because I know they can, but sometimes those things for these seemingly simple tasks are really related to these executive functioning deficits and not just being lazy and not trying. And so those are 2 red flags for me. If I hear a school saying the kid is just being lazy or not trying, or parents even attributing behaviors to that, I want to really look at executive functioning skills to see if some of that is really what might be relating to these behaviors. Okay. So what do we know about EF skills in kids with XY variation? So this is a study we did here at Children's. This looked at executive functioning skills in boys with XXY and XXYY. The parents completed an executive functioning skills questionnaire to look at these. And what we see is that the red line is where we start to consider what we call clinical significance. So if your score is above that line, we think it might have an impacting difficulty in your child's life. And we see that while the boys with XXY clearly have these difficulties, the boys with XXYY are a little bit more risk across the board for some of these problems. We've also looked here at the relationship between executive functioning and adaptive skills in boys with XXY. And what we want to know is how do these executive functioning deficits contribute to problems with daily living skills? So daily living skills are things like hygiene and cooking and keeping your room clean and dressing yourself. And again, parents completed questionnaires looking at both executive functioning skills and adaptive skills. And we found that cognitive regulation skills were related pretty highly to communication skills, which makes sense. So maybe you have problems initiating a conversation or organizing what you want to say or keeping in mind what's being said in a conversation. And then we found that behavior regulation was more related to those daily living skills and those social skills. So again, if you have a hard time inhibiting your behavior, you might have a hard time getting along with other kids, right? Because maybe you're doing stuff that's impulsive or that kids don't take well. You might have also difficulty shifting or changing your behavior to meet the demands of a situation. Another group looked at the relationship between executive function skills and behavior problems in XXY and in trisomy X. And what they saw was that both groups showed deficits in inhibition, flexibility, sustained attention, and working memory, and that deficits in inhibition were most closely related to more aggressive behavior and rule-breaking behavior. And that makes sense, right? If you have a hard time inhibiting yourself, you're going to do things impulsively, which is going to probably be potentially more aggressive or behavior that's going to break some rules. So again, I talk about this just to highlight, I think a lot of times people think about executive functioning skills in terms of academics and how it impacts kids' school functioning, but I really want to talk about how these skills impact kids across all areas of life, which we see here. Okay, I'm going to just talk briefly about development of executive functioning skills, because I think it's also important to think about how these develop in a person, and knowing when things are supposed to come on target as opposed to when we would expect these things. So we know our executive function skills are thought of as being housed in our frontal lobes, and our frontal lobes have very dense connections with other parts of our brain, which allows for the kind of the frontal lobe as being that conductor of the brain system. When you think about development of executive functioning skills, development is not linear. So it's not as though you start developing these skills and it just keeps going up, 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 but it occurs in spurts. And we know that different executive function skills kind of come online at different times, okay? So we know that even babies and young children have very, very basic executive functioning skills, such as inhibitory control. So a baby is able to inhibit behaviors that would be incompatible with them being able to get a bottle. Okay, so a baby knows how to kind of turn its head to reach the bottle. It knows not if it stops crying, the bottle will, go in the mouth easier. So a baby even starts to doing some basic inhibitory skills. Some of those more cognitive regulation skills that we talked about, like planning and organization, don't even start to come online until 7 or 8 and then continue to develop much after that. And when you have young kids, you think about that, right? So if you have a 3 or a 4-year-old, you're their executive functioning skills, right? You function as their frontal lobes. You set up their day, you set up the plan. You're not expecting them to do a lot by themselves. But later ages, we expect kids to start taking those on. Frontal brain development continues into the 20s, which is why it takes so long for these skills to develop, with major changes happening between 13 and 19 years old, okay? The depressing piece of that, executive functioning skills start declining in your 40s, okay? Wah, wah. Right. Yes?
Can you explain to me when you're saying major changes of compared to the...
So executive functioning skills have, so what really is the major executive, major brain structure changes that happen between 13 and 19? There's a lot of myelin and white matter that starts to develop during that time. And so that myelin development really has a big push in the ages between 13 and 19.
So you should see a good increase between 13 and 19?
Yes and no. Yes, normally you do. But even in normal kids, we know that this is also happening within the context of a lot of social development and social pressures, right? So the kind of classic thing about adolescent is they may know what they're supposed to do, but they don't do it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And this is just a nice little picture. This is typically developing kids. This was a study they did with functional imaging, which looked at sort of brain maturation, and you can just see over time how, a 5-year-old brain is not particularly mature in terms of these sort of frontal systems, and then as it goes on, we see more purple, which is indicative of more mature brain development in the 20-year-old. So kids don't develop in a vacuum, right? Kids develop within an environmental context. So it's also important to consider not just what's happening in the brain, but what's happening in a child's environment during this time of development. So we know that over time, there are increasing executive function demands in everyday tasks. And as a child becomes older, there's more demands for things like multi-step tasks. There's more novelty versus automaticity in learning. We go from very low stress tasks to very high stress tasks. And there's a present orientation to a future orientation. So as an example of those things, if you think about a 2nd grade class, most of the things are going to be worksheet driven, or even a 1st grade class, right? So it's in the present. I fill out this worksheet right now. That is a very familiar task to me. I know how to sit and do a worksheet. When you get into middle school, things suddenly have a future orientation. I have a book report or a big project that's due in a month. This is novel. Maybe it's something I've never done before, and there's a lot of steps to it. So we know that there's all these demands that get ramped up as kids go through school. And teachers and parents have expectations that specific skills are going to be online at certain times, and our school system is developed that way, right? So we know if we look at this and we think about this axis as being development going across, we know that the content in school really ramps up, right? So the content in high school is much higher than the content you're doing in elementary school. But what happens at the same time? The supports that we give kids goes down. Oh, my awesome graph, I went right by it. So what ends up happening is that when kids are having the lowest content demands here, we give them the most support, right? You walk into a kindergarten class, there's like 4 adults in there for 20 kids, right? You walk into a high school class when the work is much harder, there's a lot more demands, and there's 1 teacher for 35 kids, and they're expected to do everything independently. And so this is where our kids start to fall apart. right? They do okay in the earlier grades when they have a lot of support, and then as the demands ramp up, they have a lot more problems. Now, for typically developing kids, this is okay, and this is how our school system is developed. But for our kids with these problems, this is where we really need to think about what we do. So what happens when development is not typical? The child may not be able to meet the environmental demands of the situation. There's then this mismatch between the child's abilities and the expectations at school, and the greatest difficulties are really going to be seen when there's demands for independent work and demands for rapid and efficient processing of information. And these are the times when we really start to see those difficulties. These are what we consider sort of our potential academic stress points, and these are a lot of the times kids end up coming to see me for evaluations. And this is even more ramped up now, right? So it used to be that kindergarten was learning to learn and first grade was learning to read. Well, now kindergarten, the expectation is that you leave kindergarten knowing how to read, right? First grade is kind of reading to learn, the first time really having to use textbooks and novels to take in information. Middle school, learning to organize yourself, and then high school and college, obviously those expectations increase, and then being able to do things more independently without parent or teacher support. So I'm going to talk about basic principles of executive functioning interventions and what we think about when we think about how to intervene in these ways. Okay, so the big thing to think about is that these skills don't come intuitively to kids with executive function deficits. They really have to be explicitly taught. So some kids know how to study. They know how to organize their notebook. They just sort of do it without anyone really having to teach them. These are things that we really need to teach our kids in a very step-by-step manner. We want to teach a process of systematic thinking, and we want to teach the child really how to learn and how to approach tasks. There's a lot of models of executive functioning interventions. This is one that I'm going to present from a really nice book. I have some book suggestions at the end, which are really kind of helpful parent resources for how to think about these. This one is from a book written by Lauren Kenworthy and some other folks that is geared more specifically towards kids with executive functioning challenges and autism, but a lot of the recommendations are really just kind of great across the board. Okay, so one thing we're going to do, one big kind of chunk of when we think about this is we want to teach and use key scripts and words, okay? So part of it is that lots of times our kids get caught up in the language of what we're saying, right? And lots of our kids have language disorders on top of other things too. So the thing is that we're using a lot of language with them. Where's your backpack? What are you doing? Come on, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. And we might not always use the same ways of saying things too. So teaching key words and scripts that we are always going to use time and time again can be very helpful. And we want that to be consistent across settings. So if he's here, if he spends time at my house and spends time at grandma's house and spends time at school, obviously we want people to try to use those key words across settings so everyone is teaching to the same way. As I said before, we're going to explicitly teach these skills, and we're going to teach them in a very structured and systematic way. The next thing we want to think about is that we're going to teach by doing, okay? And again, we're going to think back to how did we teach our kids when they were 3 or 4, right? We taught them by doing, and we scaffolded what they did, and then we took support away once they could master these skills independently. So we're going to be doing kind of the same thing, but just at a higher level for higher level types of skills. So we want to be an active coach. This isn't the kind of thing that you're just going to kind of hand your kid and be like, okay, good luck getting those executive functioning skills going. You're really going to work closely with them on these kinds of things. We also want to use everyday people and everyday activities, and this is important. So people really started thinking a lot about executive functioning skills in the 80s, and they thought about this a lot in terms of rehab after people had had brain injuries, okay? So they did a lot of work on this with folks in inpatient rehab settings post-brain injury. And what they were using at the time was a lot of computer programs to try to increase his executive functioning skills. And what they found was that people got really good at these computer programs with executive functioning skills, but it didn't generalize to real life. And so because of that, we know the research now tells us that for this to really generalize and work, we need to use everyday people and everyday activities. So while it's great to have a speech therapist or a tutor work on these things, we want to make sure that that person is using everyday kinds of things, assignments from school, real tasks at home, to really work on these kinds of skills. We're going to model strategies for them, so we're going to model our own executive functioning skills. And then we're going to provide, again, scaffolding. We're going to support them. We're going to fade our support and watch the skills generalize to their own use. Yes?
Can you provide an example of modeling executive functioning skills?
Yeah, so I'll be giving some examples, but an easy one is we're going on vacation. Okay, lots of executive functioning skills go into going to vacation, or even we're going to run errands on a Saturday morning. So a lot of this stuff, when I talk to parents, a lot of this stuff we do as adults in our head without even thinking about it, right? But instead you say, okay, Sally, come on over. We have 5 errands to run this morning. Can you help me think through what we should do first? Well, maybe we shouldn't go to the grocery store first because we're buying ice cream, and then we have to go to the sporting goods store to get a new baseball bat, and the ice cream will melt while we're there. So these are the kinds of things that we're doing constantly. They don't have to be big, huge things. Just talking through things and letting kids see how you do stuff is helpful. We're going to use visual supports and routines. Again, a lot of our kids get lost in language, and a lot of our kids have working memory problems, which means they can't keep those things in their mind. So using visual supports, lists, routines are going to be helpful. So things like checklists, cues, whiteboards are going to be important. And then we're going to try to make it fun. Yay, executive functioning skill interventions, right? But these are hard skills to work on, okay? And you're usually working on these things with an older child or an adolescent, right? So it's not like when you did potty training with your kid and you could just give them an M&M every time they go to the bathroom, right? This is gonna take a long time to get these skills, and you want it to be fun for everyone. And so we're gonna talk about, can we use humor, can we use rewards, and also how are we gonna collaborate with our child? So what we found too is that it's most helpful to do this with your kid, as opposed to saying, okay, let's sit down and do this, you know, or this is what you're going to do because you can't seem to get through the shower. Is instead we're gonna say, let's figure out it seems like taking a shower is really hard for you. Let's think this through, and what are the barriers? What's making taking a shower hard? And let's work on this together. And then through this cycle of these kind of 4 points, we start to work on these kind of skills and increase them with these kinds of interventions. Okay, so as we think through a task, we want to think through what are the executive function demands of this task. Does it require multi-steps or multitasking? Does it require planning ahead of time? Does it require the child to take something big and break it down into smaller pieces? Does it require you to change your behavior in some way, or change situations, or be flexible? So again, some of these tasks we take for granted that seem very simple, but when we break it down, we really think there are a lot of things that go into some of these things. When we think about interventions, we think about 2 levels of interventions. So one is intervening at the level of the environment. So these are changes that adults or teachers can implement. So for example, maybe we change the environment itself. So we reduce distractions. So if maybe there's a child who has a hard time getting through work at school because they're very distracted by what's going on around them, so we give them a study carrel, or we have them complete a test in the resource room instead of the general classroom. Maybe we change the nature of the task. So maybe we make it more structured. Maybe we give the child a checklist to follow while completing it. Or maybe that we change the way we interact with the child. So while obviously sometimes things come out of the blue, lots of times you can anticipate when your child might be about to have difficulty in maybe a social or behavioral situation. And so we are going to change the way we interact to anticipate those problems and try to prevent them before happening. We're also going to provide modeling and scaffolds that are generally reduced as the child gains skills. Then we're also going to intervene at the level of the child. So for the level of the child, we're going to give them explicit instructions and executive functioning strategies. And in other words, kind of giving them a toolkit that they can kind of pull out of their pocket for different kinds of skills. And again, this gets back to the fact that some of these kids really learn this stuff pretty intuitively, whereas we really need to teach and give strategies to kids with these kinds of deficits. So if we think about working memory, a main way is to decrease working memory load, right? So instead of giving a 3-step instruction, I'm going to give a 1-step instruction. We're going to keep instructions clear and concise, give them one at a time, give them in written and oral format, provide a hard copy. So sometimes parents, I know, will use a whiteboard or a wipe-off sheet, whatever those things are called, in the bathroom that you check off. I brushed my teeth, I washed my face, I used the bathroom, I took my medication. Then you don't have to remember all those things at once. You check them off, and then you wipe it off, and it's ready for the next day. We're going to teach information in smaller chunks in school. We're going to repeat instructions as needed. We can also encourage the child to repeat or paraphrase what was said. So, Johnny, I asked you to do this. What did I ask you to do? What are you going to go do? What are you going to do first, and what are you going to do next? And then in terms of giving them strategies and tools to use, you know, I was in here, or I was in the talk given by talking about adult living and adult transition, and she talked a lot about these kind of, you know, using lots of apps. I mean, there's apps for everything now, right? So using apps for memory aids, teaching kids at pretty young ages how to use that calendar function on your phone, how to use the notes function on your phone, how do you set reminders on your phone. So, what we do is we start teaching these skills early on, 10, 11, and sometimes families will give, it's not necessarily a phone, but you can give an old phone without the phone part, so it's kind of like an old iPod or something, but you can still use the calendar and other things in it so that they can start to learn how these things at a very basic level, then you build on that skill as they get older and older. We're also going to teach very specific strategies, so teaching active listening or active reading strategies. So you're going to teach kids to, when you're giving them instructions, to stop what they are doing, focus their attention on you, ask questions right in the moment, and relate that information to what they're going to do next. While they're reading, they can do something similar, writing down who's the main character, what's happening, what is the theme, so that, again, they're not keeping that on their working memory. Then they finish the chapter and they have no idea what happened in that chapter. Another thing that I know is always a big problem with kids is kind of planning and organization and kind of thinking through, again, how do I tackle these big tasks? So planning problems are usually the result of not knowing what step to take next, right? And so cleaning the room is a great example of this. So you walk in and there's just stuff everywhere, and that's super overwhelming because kids with executive functioning problems won't really know where to start or where to go next with those kinds of things. So we're going to break long-term projects or a big task like cleaning a room into clearly defined subtasks, right? So maybe we have the bin for the books, or the bin for the toys, or the bin for the clothes. And the thing with this is part of it too is, we'll talk about this too a little bit later, is knowing when to pick your battles, right? And so is it okay if do all the books need to be very neatly on the bookshelf, or are you okay with all the big books just being put in a box? Okay? Is books in the box better than books all over the floor? Or toys in the box better than toys over the floor? Maybe not as great as toys neatly on a shelf, but again, what can you kind of manage and what can your kid manage to get these things done? We're going to provide templates or lists of steps to be followed, so that's a good example for cleaning your room too. So even when my kids were little, I did a picture-based list for how to clean your room. There was a picture of a bed, you make your bed. There was a picture of the hamper, you put your clothes in the hamper. And there was a picture of the toy box, you put your toys in the toy box. So you can do this even with kids who aren't reading yet, right? With older kids, you can obviously use words. And then we think about sometimes making a cookbook of common tasks. And we think about this lots of times for things like school tasks or math problems, where you actually have a little notebook where you write down, okay, for this kind of math problem, this is always the routine that you use. They can pull out their little cookbook of routines when they're sitting down to do homework or sitting down to do tasks around the house. Setting aside planning time is also important for older students to plan assignments. So lots of times we also recommend this be done as part of school or with a resource teacher, so that when they do have these big projects, they're actually sitting down with someone who can say, okay, what's our plan? What are we doing first? What are we doing next? Having children verbalize a plan before starting a task can also just help give them that 3 seconds of, oh, what is my plan for this? Instead of jumping into it. It doesn't need to be a grand plan, but it might just need to be, I'm going to work for 10 minutes and then I'm going to take a break, just to kind of have that little moment of planning. And then we're going to teach specific routines to identify goals, plan steps to attain the goal. So at the early stages, I'm going to show you some worksheets for this. We're going to talk about, what's our goal? So maybe our goal is to clean our room. What do you do first? What do you do next? So you're really working the kid through that plan step by step in the beginning. With more success, your prompts become more general. Okay, let's make a list of all the things you have to do to complete this project or complete this task, and then over time your child internalizes their ability to do that more independently. So again, as with the younger kid tasks, we're providing a lot of scaffolding up front, a lot of help, a lot of I'm going to help you break this down, to okay, you break it down with me jumping in if needed, to them breaking it down on their own. So some of the books that I'll recommend at the end have some really nice worksheets and things in there that you can just kind of photocopy or rip out to use, and this is one example. This is an example of a desk cleaning checklist, okay? Because again, these things are overwhelming, right? You look at a kid's desk and you think, how hard is it really to throw all the trash away? But these things get overwhelming. So desk cleaning checklist, the first part is, what do I need to clean my desk, okay? So before we even start cleaning the desk, what do I need? Well, maybe I need a trash can, maybe some paper clips, a stapler. What do I need to get my desk organized? Step 2, I follow my desk cleaning procedure. I empty the whole desk out. I sort everything into 2 piles. I throw away the don't save pile. I sort the save stuff into 2 piles. I put the home stuff into my backpack. I put the school stuff back in. I organize things, and I put the school materials neatly back in my desk. Part of kids with executive functioning problems too is that, as we talked about, they don't always know how to start a task. They don't always know when a task is over. either. So what does clean mean? Does clean mean that I moved my water bottle from this side of the desk to this side of the desk and my desk is now clean? And so these checklists can also help to say, okay, now I know what this means when the task is over, as well as how to help me where to start. So this is a very specific list, right? This walks the kid through it step by step by step. Then maybe you move on to this kind of list, okay, where what is my clean room checklist? So steps to clean up a room. Maybe you have the child start to work to clean this up themselves, fill this out themselves. So maybe they look at the room and figure out, okay, what does need to get done to get this room clean? Okay, maybe to pick up my toys, pick up my books, put my homework away. And so this is a little bit more of an open-ended kind of list. Then this is a classic sort of planning intervention, and this has been around for years and years and years. We used to call it the goal, plan, do, review, but review is too hard for kids to understand, so now we call it goal, plan, do, check worksheet, okay? So the idea here, this is much more open-ended. So in the goal, you write what is your goal, and this could be a goal for anything, school, saving money, something around the house. So the goal is what do we want to do? The plan is how will we do it? So you talk through the steps, and again, you might talk through, well, what do you think you should do? If that doesn't work, what are we going to do next? So again, you're providing some support for this. Do, when should we try our plan? And then the check is we go back after the plan and think about how it worked. And that's the key there. So we always want to return, how well did our plan work? Because maybe the plan didn't work at all, right? And so then you want to go back and think through, well, how come our plan didn't work and what do we want to try differently next time? Okay. Behavior regulation. So a lot of kids with, that we work with have ADHD, right? And so behavior regulation is a big problem with kids with ADHD. Excuse me. They're up and out of their seat. They can't get things done, right? So we think about environmental modifications. What are we going to change the environment? We're going to have them sit near the teacher. We're going to have them sit away from distractions. We're going to do frequent teacher check-ins. These can be just little things, walking by the desk and making sure that Bobby is still on task with what he's supposed to be doing. We're going to have regular breaks. I've had kids who maybe need a break every 45 minutes or so. So maybe one of their jobs is to carry a note down to the teacher at the end of the hallway. It's a blank piece of paper, doesn't say anything, but it gets the kid out of the room and it gets him moving and up and done so he can come back and focus again. We're going to emphasize quality of work rather than quantity. A lot of kids rush through a worksheet because they want to just get it all done. But what we say is you're going to have 10 minutes to do this worksheet, and we want to see how many you got right, not how many you can get done. Okay, and so we may have to shorten assignments or things. Or we also sometimes do things like put a check box at the top of the worksheet to ensure that when they go through it, they have to check that box to show they check their work. And then the reinforcement is based on, or the grade is then based on what they got right, not how many they completed. We're going to teach behavior regulation strategies. So we're going to teach response delay techniques. So some of these we might use. I'm going to count to 10 before I respond to what you're saying to me so that I can make sure that I'm not reacting impulsively. Or even teaching kids to leave the situation. If you are starting to feel angry, it's okay to walk away from those kinds of things. Stop, think, talk, do is sort of a classic cognitive behavioral strategy that we teach kids. So we're going to think about stopping the behavior before acting impulsively, thinking through what's the cause and effect relationship of our behavior, say or verbalize to myself or someone else what to do, and then do the chosen behavior. Well, young kids can do very simple things like that. So, you know, even toddlers can do a very basic, now again, it's not going to be high level, but you could, you know, teach pretty young kids to do very simple stop. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
On behavior regulation, like my son is a follower.
Mm-hmm.
He does fine on his own. I mean, he behaves well and all that. But then the moment, like his friend is starting to mess around in class and all that, then he starts doing it, following suit. Even if the teacher's, I mean, even
Right.
if he just got in trouble with the teacher.
Yeah.
How would you work on that type of regulation? Because,
That-
I mean, that's following, you know what I mean?
Right, I mean,
That's
that's more kind of, I think that would fall more into kind of social skills kind of intervention kinds of things. Because then
Oh,
it's not so much inhibiting, it's inhibiting under the influence of what my peers are doing, right?
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm going to talk about social skills in a minute, too.
Oh, okay.
And then sometimes with kids who are diagnosed with ADHD, we do think about medications as well in terms of helping them to regulate their behavior. So for social skills interventions, again, we want to think about what executive deficits are contributing to social difficulties? So it could be lots of things, right? It could be that the child is having initiating conversations difficulty, or the child has difficulty saying appropriate things to others, the child has difficulty sustaining conversation. So again, we want to think about look at the child and think, what are the social difficulties that are happening, and what kinds of executive functions are contributing to that, and then how are we going to intervene for that? So part of it for social skills too is modeling and discussing our own social concerns and worries and how we deal with them. So again, a lot of this as adults we do in our head, right? But you might think as a parent like, ooh, well, I have to go to this PTA meeting and I don't know anybody there and I'm a little nervous about that. I don't know who the people are going to be. And so talking about that with your kid is perfectly reasonable, and talk and model about how you deal with some difficult social situations that maybe you've been in. We're going to provide additional structure to social situations. So especially for younger kids, for example, it might be hard to just have a play date. So maybe every play date has a focus. Well, this play date we're going to do Play-Doh, or this play date we're going to play with the water table, so that we provide some structure to the situations. For kids who have more significant social difficulties, we think about things like providing social scripts to follow in social situations, and these kinds of things are usually some of the goals of social skills training programs. So when you are in this kind of situation, what is the script that you can follow to deal with this kind of situation? Sometimes we also think about discussing ahead of time and making a plan. So maybe this child always has difficulty at recess. Recess is always a problem because he doesn't know who to play with, or he's always getting into fights with a certain kid. And so we think about beforehand, the teacher's going to pull that child aside and say, well, who are you going to talk to? What are you going to say to this person? What are you going to do to help make a plan right before he heads out for recess, so they know, hopefully, that he'll be more on target. And then again, after the fact, processing situations that maybe didn't go well. Well, I know you really wanted to play with Johnny during recess, but he was using the ball and you wanted to use the ball. So, instead of using your words, you just grabbed it from him and then he got really mad at you. So what's something else you could have done differently? What should you do next time? So processing those kinds of situations after the fact. And the important thing about processing that is doing that at a time when the child is not emotionally still freaking out, for lack of a better word, from that situation. So you're not going to do it the minute he comes in from recess and just got in trouble with the teacher and is crying hysterically. You're going to do it later on when he's calmed down, when he's going to be more open and receptive to having that kind of discussion. And then obviously we think about more formal social skills group. Lots of schools have lunch bunches run by the school psychologist or the school social worker to help work on these things, again, right in the school setting. Okay, so for emotional and behavioral difficulties, we're going to think about the same sort of thing. So where is the breakdown for emotional and behavioral difficulties as well? So again, it's okay to teach kids to take a time out when they need to leave a situation, and that includes in dealing with us. So I think it's also okay to teach kids, if you're having a heated discussion with your kid, that both of you maybe need to take a time out, think about what's going to happen next, and then come back and talk about that discussion again when you're both more calm. We want to help teach an emotional vocabulary. So lots of times our kids have a hard time really putting words to what they're feeling, and they might say, well, I'm really upset. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean they're angry? Does that mean they're sad? Does that mean they're frustrated? And so working with them to really develop this emotional vocabulary, because your intervention for someone who's angry might be different than your intervention for someone who's sad or frustrated. So helping develop that emotional vocabulary can also be helpful. Using keywords and scripts, this gets back to a little bit what I was talking about before, for kids who are getting stuck. And this book that I mentioned, which I'll show you again in a minute, talks about really teaching kids, if I'm flexible, more good things happen to me. If I get stuck, that really limits my options and limits what can happen, but if I'm flexible, more things can happen that are good. And so they talk about things like plan A and plan B. Well, it's always important to have a plan B if plan A doesn't work, so we always know, what is plan B going to be? Is this a big deal or a little deal? I use this one with my kids all the time, okay? Is dropping your Swedish fish on the floor a big deal or a little deal? It's a big deal, we know, right? Is it a big deal or a little deal? And if it's a big deal, how do we make it a little deal? Okay, so we're not just going to discount it and say, ugh, dropping your fish is not a big deal, just stop crying. I'm going to figure out, well, maybe that's a big deal right now, but how can we make that a little deal? Okay? Choice, no choice. There are some situations where we have no choice, right? And this is good modeling. Maybe I get pulled over for speeding and I get a speeding ticket and I can say, man, that really stinks that I got a speeding ticket, but this for mom is a no choice situation. I have to pay this speeding ticket. And so we think about there are some situations where you have a choice and some situations where there are no choice situations. And again, you use those words as part of your script to describe choice versus no choice situations. And then also, how can we compromise? I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute. The other thing to think about is using strategies to increase awareness for problems with emotional regulation. So things like really making these things concrete. Again, emotions are very vague and abstract, and what I feel might not be what someone else feels. But how can I make those feelings more concrete? So we think about using things like a speedometer to gauge emotion. So am I at a 10 right now, or am I at a 50 right now in terms of my emotions? I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute as well. Okay, so this is an example of how do we compromise, and this is again from that same book that I mentioned before, and they talk about even doing this like on a whiteboard, again, making it visual, using cues as we talk through these things. And so say that the situation is John has a book that I want, right? I have two choices. If I'm stuck, I might hit John and take the book, right? If I compromise, I might ask John for a turn. What happens if I hit John and take the book? Well, I get put in timeout and I miss my TV time. What happens if I compromise? I'm going to look at the book, give it back, and I get my TV time. And then in both those situations, we say, was this what I wanted? Did I want to get put in timeout and lose TV, or did I want to, compromise? And so again, you working through these situations help to see, is this a big deal, little deal? Can I be stuck or unstuck, to sort of see through visually what the consequences of my actions are.
When you're doing that, is that too much language for them though?
It could be. Again, it depends on the kid, and so some of these you would have to, and again, if you get some of these books, you may have to modify things, so some of these are ideas for, to be modified based on your kid's level. Okay, here's an example of a speedometer. So 10 is, I'm normal, I'm not mad. 30 is, well, I'm kind of getting mad. And the importance to this is that we're not just defining the emotion, but we're also linking it with a behavior. So when I'm a 30, what can I do, okay? So when I'm a 30, maybe I use counting to delay my response. So maybe I count to 10 so I can calm down a little bit. 60 is, okay, I feel like I might lose control here, so I'm gonna go find an adult for help. Maybe 100 is, I'm really out of control, I'm really, really angry, so I'm gonna immediately leave that situation. So again, helping kids to define the emotion, not just define it, but also give them the response that will help them to manage that situation as well. Okay, I hear clapping in the next room. I must be coming close to my time. Okay, so the thing is to think about is, so these things are hard to do, right? They're hard to do consistently. We can't do them for every situation. And what ends up happening, and I see it in my house too, is that we spiral, right? So my child is stressed, then I get stressed because my child is stressed, then my child gets more stressed because I'm stressed, and then the cycle goes, right? So I say to my son, Finn, get your backpack. And then he gets stressed because he knows, I don't know where my backpack is. And I'm, how can you not know where your backpack is? We have to leave for school in 10 minutes. And then he's like, well, I don't know where it is. I just can't find it. And then everyone is screaming at each other, and everyone has to leave for school feeling kind of crummy, right? And so part of it is how do we break that cycle of stress, and how do we maintain motivation for this over time? So one thing is to keep it positive, and one thing they talk about is 4 elements of praise to every command or reprimand, okay? Now this obviously is not an exact ratio. You don't have to sit there and count up, well, did I give my 4 praises? But I think the things to think about is kids with disabilities, and even just kids in general, they hear a lot of no and they hear a lot of negative. Don't do that. Stop doing that. Why are you doing that? How come you can't find your homework? How come you can't do this? And they don't hear a lot of positive. And part of that is because when they're doing good stuff, we don't recognize it. We just expect them to do good stuff, right? So part of it is when they are sitting and nicely coloring, you say, oh man, that's awesome. Look how well you're coloring, okay? We think about praise should be specific and true, okay? Kids know when we're BSing them, right, for lack of a better word, So if we say, oh, you're the smartest kid on earth. Nah, my kid's not the smartest kid on earth. I can say that, outright. So try to make it true and try to make it specific. And again, try to catch kids doing something positive to increase that praise that they get. We want to use a reward system, okay? So sometimes parents don't want to bribe my kid, but you know what? Internal motivation is not a strength of kids. Kids don't do things just because it makes them feel good, right? Kids do things because they want to please others, they want praise, they want to earn things. And so using reward systems is helpful. It doesn't have to be that your kid's going to earn some giant Lego set for every little thing they do, but working rewards and incentives into things. And this book had a nice quote from a child with autism who said, "When something is difficult or unexpected, getting bonus points helps to reset my brain." So again, these are things that are really hard for kids. For any of us, something that's hard, we're more motivated to do that when we have an external motivator, right? So keeping in mind, how can we motivate kids to keep on task for this? Expect more, get more. So sometimes I think we underestimate what our kids can do, or we just think, well, of course they can't do that, you know? So with it, again, you know, I heard a nice quote, and the other thing is if your kid can, you know, use YouTube and use Facebook, then there's lots of things they can do on their phone, there's lots of things they can do around the house. So again, maybe laundry seems like an overwhelming task, but maybe they can do laundry if you write the list out of the steps that need to happen and put it right on the washing machine. And so again, keeping our expectations up for kids and helping them to rise these expectations. We're gonna pick our battles, right? We do that all the time in parenting. We're not gonna, if we wanna do executive functioning interventions, we're not gonna pick everything at once. We're gonna pick one or two things that really drive us crazy, focus on those first. Don't just do something, sit there. So lots of times I think as parents, we respond impulsively too, right? So we see something and we feel like, oh, I gotta manage that right away. Sit back yourself for a few minutes and think, how do I wanna manage this? What do I wanna do about this situation? And then importantly, to keep your sense of humor. And this is keep your sense of humor as a parent and keep your sense of humor with your kids too. So maybe you do this nice goal, plan, do, check, and the plan totally tanks, everything goes wrong, and maybe instead of getting frustrated and mad about it, you sit about that together and you go, oh man, that did not work, right? And then you kind of can have a humor about it. Don't think that everything that goes wrong is necessarily a bad learning experience for everyone. And keep your sense of humor for things like when your kids do the unexpected using their good executive functioning skills, right? So when you're like me and you have a 3-year-old and you keep the lollipops hidden and your 3-year-old watches to see where you hide the lollipops and then uses his good emerging executive functioning skills to see when you're not paying attention and pulls the stool over to the giant cabinet and climbs up to the 4th shelf to get the lollipops, and you come back in the kitchen to this. It's important to keep your sense of humor about things, right? Okay, I have like 2 seconds left here, I think. So these are the books, okay? This one, they're all very, very good books. The one that I have the circle around is the one that is geared more toward kids with autism. People are taking pictures, so I'll let you guys take pictures, okay? I'm just going to very quickly give a plug for neuropsychology. It says, as a neuropsychologist, I can't not talk about neuropsychology up here. So lots of times, it's important to have assessment to help figure out what interventions are important. Many of our kids have psychological or psychoeducational assessments through the school, which usually look at things like IQ, academics, and social emotional functioning. Neuropsychological evaluations look at those things plus all of this, okay? And so sometimes having the neuropsychological evaluation can help to supplement any testing the school does to really help to break down where some of these strengths and weaknesses are to help better form more effective interventions. And then I know there's a whole talk happening tomorrow, I think, about IEPs and 504 plans, so I won't talk about that too much. But those neuropsychological evaluations can then really help your IEP team to figure out what kind of goals to put into place. And so our take-home message is we know kids are at risk. We want to be aware of increased times of risk, so transition points in school, certain situations. Be aware of how behavior is interpreted. Use task analysis, and then use consistent interventions, and be patient, as it is going to take a long time for these skills to come on board.